Hey everybody, and welcome back to our scenario playthrough series. This is number 24, Canary Mines. If you remember from Millennium Mines last go-around, we had a meandering train that we removed and rebuilt. And that was it. This time we've got 2 dive coasters to start us out, so that's going to be a good moneymaker for us. We've got to get 1,300 guests by the end of October year 3, park rating of 600. And this is what we've got to work with here. We've got a weird pathway layout, starting underground to the mine itself, which is sort of like a depression in the middle of this mountain. And we have the train that kind of winds its way through there. We've got a fair number of rides to start with, but we're going to start out with some shops and stalls so we can get some food to start. I always like to have at least a food, a drink, the info kiosk, and a restroom, since that is all we really need to keep the guests happy on that front. So let's start out with trying to build ourselves a new entrance. I really don't love how the current entrance sort of finds its way in sort of randomly down at the bottom. So I actually want to bring the guests up a little bit and kind of start in so you get a little bit of an overlook into this valley of a park. So we're going to do that right here, kind of connect across, and eventually we'll remove the other one down there. But for now we're going to keep that one connected, and we'll start up here sort of in this kind of flat area. We do get more than just the kind of dirt area to work with. We get a little bit of grass on the front end and kind of surrounding onto the side, so we're going to use that to our advantage. But this little entrance will serve as a place to kind of get the guests in, give a nice little overview of the park, have some scenery there, get a couple of food stands, and just kind of get us started in this whole venture. So of course we have our usual suspects to begin with. We've got our scrambler here, so we're going to go ahead and place that on this kind of edge right here. Kind of seems like it'll be a cool effect there to be having all those kind of lateral forces pushing you out towards the edge, which is just sort of a drop off into this mine. So we're going to try and take advantage of those different elevation changes and stuff like that, and use those to our best ability. And here we are, just kind of dropping in a couple of the usual restrooms and shops and other things I didn't forget this time, which is usually what happens, but we'll get there eventually. So trying to see where things are set up right now, because this pathway layout is fairly confusing, and to be honest, we'd like to simplify it. There's really no reason to have a lot of these underground sections, but for now we'll eventually kind of work our way around that just a bit and try and smooth this thing out. But I thought a swinging ship would fit right here, and we can kind of put our queue going off to the side. One of the annoying things with this one is that every time it rains, the colors kind of get all weird on this one, so apologies for that as you're viewing this one. But the fact of the matter is that it just rains, so I don't recall it being much rain though, but it's hopefully not too bad. So we got 2 of our thrill rides in there to begin with. Differently than before, we are not putting a carousel in to start, so that's just not really any particular rhyme or reason for that. We just didn't. So what I want to do now is basically create an above ground section of path that goes around here, because right now there's kind of this one that cuts through the middle down at the bottom of the valley. If you notice, one of the very first things that we did when we opened the map was connect over at the train entrance and exit over to the green dive coaster entrance and exit, because that makes ourselves a loop of path. And really that's what we want, because we had sort of an awkward dead end that if you didn't fix that, it could become an issue eventually. And now what you can see us doing is starting to rework the railroad. So as you may know from previous videos, I really don't like railroads that have elevation change in them. And I say that here knowing full well that in the next episode we're going to introduce a little bit of elevation change on this railroad. So I am being completely hypocritical here, but that's how it goes. But that said, when we say elevation change, 1 or 2 can be acceptable, but this whole thing where we're basically looking at a roller coaster worth of train, not really my thing unless you're talking about like a cog railway or something, which we don't have here. So we're going to get rid of that, and we're going to replace it with something else. But the first thing before that is to start to build ourselves a railroad to replace that. And it's going to be far less, interesting, you would say, compared to the one that's there now. but it does give a nice overview of the park, and it will have a single station there at the front, and it will have covered cars. That's a key one, so that every time it rains, everybody will ride it. So that will be nice just to have some covering and a good extra ride for that sort of thing. There's not too much to connect with so far, and we can keep it level the entire way for now. One of the other things that is maybe a bit of a pet peeve of mine is having a railroad in a theme park that has a ton of ride vehicles, and trains, I guess, in this instance. You just don't see that in real life. The engines are fairly expensive, and you're not really going to see a park that's got a ton of these unless it's a fairly big system. So I don't really love having 3, 4, 5 trains unless you have a pretty big system, like Disney, for example. But in this instance, we're just going to do one train, a lot of cars, and set it up like that. So now what we're going to do is replace that train in the general path, not exactly the same path, but we're going to replace it with a mine train coaster. And I don't really think of this necessarily as a coaster, although it will operate as one. I mean, we can only do so much with the original game rides, but I'm kind of picturing this as a kind of mine exploration type ride. If anybody's been to Knott's Berry Farm and has done the Calico mine ride, so similar idea to that. Or actually, I think I said that one wrong. I think Calico's the flume, but anyway, the mine ride at Knott's. That is sort of the inspiration here. So kind of a ride through some tunnels, through some scenery. Kind of expect that there's probably some maybe show scenes in the tunnels, things like that. And we're going to put one lift in the center here. We're not going to have coaster-style drops. We're not going to have things of that nature, but we will have a couple of elevation changes, as you can see. So it's going to pick up some speed, but we're not really going to have airtime hills or other stuff like that. And I'm not building this for stats. I fully expect that I'm going to get stat penalties every which way, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about it. What I want to do is just kind of have this replacement for the train into something that feels slightly more plausible. So we're doing our first reroute of the new railroad, which will become a running theme in this as we continue to move it around for other stuff. But here, we're going to go ahead and try and figure out how to get this thing back to the station, which is on the absolute other end. But this does allow us to put in a block section and some other stuff. We've got some scenery here, which is kind of nice, and we have our queue that is already existing, so it's all good as far as that goes. Gives us something to work from. What I'm going to do in order to figure out how this thing sits is build a secondary ride, mine ride, so it's kind of be a dummy track effectively. And this means that I don't have to build the actual ride over to this spot so I can test it out since it's not contiguous to the rest of it. But this lets me sort of test out some options and see what fits and what doesn't, and then eventually I will delete this one and replace it with the actual ride. So it's a good strategy just for trying to figure out how things fit in general, and I'd recommend it for coaster building or really any tracked ride building that is being a little bit of a thorn in your side perhaps. So I'm trying to keep this relatively low to the ground and in a lot of cases on the ground, just because I'd rather have no supports on this, because we're trying to act like this is a train. I mean, it's a mine train specifically, but we're trying to act like this is kind of a an old piece of something, whether it's themed to be that or it actually is. The kind of working thing that I've got in here is maybe like a ghost train through the mine or something, so it's maybe carry some kind of a spooky storyline or narration or something. I don't really know. It's one of those sort of use your imagination type things, but it's something that I had in mind anyway. Did do a little bit of a bump there at the end of it just to give you some kind of a slightly decent bit of airtime or something there. Maybe it's not airtime, but just a sort of something fun, I guess, for an ending section. Then we'll have a nice long break run here so we can run a couple of different trains. I think we're going to try and run 3 trains to begin with, but we're going to screw that up here in a minute as you can see where we test this thing out and add in another one of our trains here. So if you catch in the corner, you'll be able to see a one of the trains kind of backing its way up through the ride there for just a second. Don't blink. But we actually started this thing out with 4 trains. There we go, having that one go backwards. 4 trains was sort of accidental just based on how many block breaks we had, and that very last block break that I had set up in there so that it would clear the track sooner and get off of that lift hill sooner for the next train meant that if a train gets stopped there, once the block brake releases, it's sitting on a hill going upwards, so it's going to fall backwards off of that hill. So a bit of an amateur hour move right there, and we needed 3 trains anyway, so we're going to go ahead and bring that back. In the meantime, we're going to put in some trash cans and some benches just because I completely forgot to do this. I remember the food and beverage stalls, but not the things to put the trash in. So, oops for that one. And we're going to have a fair bit of trash and just debris to deal with. This is going to be sort of a running theme in this park, just keeping up with the litter and everything. Generally, this can be solved by hiring enough handymen and doing the fixed position locations for them, but I just don't like doing that, mostly because I'm lazy, but it kind of is what it is. So we're going to avoid that for now. You can also see I closed off finally the original entrance there and also the rest of the pathways down into the bottom of the mountain or valley, I guess. The idea behind this is I don't really want the path down there. I kind of want the rides down there and the path to be on the upper side. So we don't necessarily need that extra amount of path. We're going to have effectively just one big loop and then have a couple other spurs off of the thing and maybe a second loop here at some point. But the space down in the mountain, the valley down there, we are going to stick rides in instead. It feels like a better place for the ride, so why not put it there? So speaking of rides, we'll put in a shot tower here inside this turnaround for the coaster. Seems like a good spot for the turnaround. Speaking of these coasters, there's actually not a whole lot that I want to change on these, and we're not going to in the end. The only one we're going to eventually adjust is the green one here because it is going to be in the way of another ride, so that's about it. We can go block brakes, and we will do that at the very end, and there definitely are realistic changes that can be made on these rides, but for the most part, they're fine. They're not too offensive in terms of that, so we're going to generally just leave it as is. I'm going to do one of these multicolored drop towers again just because I think they're fun, so we'll go ahead and do that as detonator as our theme. So we'll go ahead and set that up. We don't have dynamite theming or anything, which would be kind of neat to have, but it would be kind of cool. So now we can delete the rest of that pathway down here, and we can open ourselves up to do more things. And there's a lot of space down here to stick some stuff in. We're going to pull a couple of pages from where we were in Millennium Mines, if you remember that stream from a while ago, including a flooded mine type rapids ride and some trucks and some other things. Here is our first ride rename to the bauxite centrifuge system. So this became sort of an inside running joke during our stream that this was a former bauxite mine, so everything has a bauxite name or theme to it. I'm not entirely sure how you themed bauxite, but there we are. It's mine theming, I guess. So props to the folks who joined the stream and suggested ride names and continued our little kind of jokes throughout. So if you ever do want to catch any of our streams live, twitch.tv/Amusement Academy is the place for it. I am usually live at 9 p.m. GMT plus 3, so that's on Fridays if you ever feel like joining. But anyway, back to the build as we look at a Steel Wild Mouse. So Steel Wild Mouse is one of the new rides that we get in the Corkscrew Follies expansion pack, and we're going to do a fairly simple kind of standard mouse. It's maybe a little bit too narrow compared to how it maybe ought to be, but we're in general going to follow the same layout of a pretty standard Mock Wild Mouse. We don't have quite the same amount of space to do like a proper layout, like as a full recreation, but it's close enough, and I think it's got a decent look to it. I'm going to go ahead and put in some block brakes and everything so we can get this to work correctly. Part of one of the challenges of doing a wild mouse, if you use block brakes, which you should use them on every coaster that allows them to, is trying to make sure that you can maintain the pacing of the ride, but set it up in such a way that if you stop on any of the block brakes, you can make it back to the station. So that's one of the key things that's very important as you're building to keep that in mind. So we don't have the mine cars. I think that may have been something that came later. Might even have been an RCT2 thing. But we do have these kind of giant wide mouse cars, which are based off of the Arrow Wild Mouse cars in real life. But strangely, the track is, I guess, more towards like an Arrow Wild Mouse, but we don't have all the elements that an Arrow Mouse would have. But we're going to go ahead and save this guy so we can rebuild him just a little bit lower into the ground here. That way we can sink the whole thing down, because it was kind of sitting up maybe a little bit high. We want to avoid that. So we're going to sit this thing down fairly decently, and going to go through here and also lower some sections here where the ride touches the ground, because unlike the mine train, we want this one to be off of the ground. So we'll make sure that that happens. I'm going to do a couple of these sort of RCT1 style buildings here where it's just the raised land with a texture and a roof texture. So we're going to use the steel kind of rusted roof texture, and then I'm going to change these here in a second to the pipes sidewalls, just because the wood is pretty much everywhere else. So in this instance, it kind of makes sense to do something a little bit different to stand out. I'm also going to go ahead and paint this with the kind of tan sandy color, which I always sort of liken to concrete in a way. So it's sort of this maybe gravelly, sandy, concrete type surface. And I'm also going to go through here and put another section of this, what we just call the ghost mine, into a tunnel. So that's going to give us some space to set our queue and our exit on top of over here, and it will make this feel just a little bit more natural and into the space. So we can go ahead and drop this guy in there. Now on the back side of this, we have that train that's still just kind of existing, and could maybe use a little bit of work here, because I don't love it just sitting up on top of this giant trestle the whole way around. So as we put in a couple more buildings here, I'm also going to look at what we can do to get rid of a little bit of that trestle, and part of that's going to be bringing up the land just to make it fit slightly better. But first we need to connect over the pathway here. So this is going to be sort of a dead-end little plaza on this side, and you can kind of see the guests coming around now to it, and it gives a nice little interaction with the ghost mine and then also the train too. So you can see what we did here is bring up the land around this, so it's sort of a artificial built up kind of archways, I guess, with the queue and pathways going underneath of it. But it's a start to get us away from the sort of wood trestle elements. We will keep some of those, but not all of them. Here I'm also trying to take advantage of a little bit of space in here to drop ourselves some food. Candy apple stall, that's another new one here for the expansion pack, I believe. And we'll stick that guy in there and put some food and some benches and all that kind of thing. Although not too many trash cans, maybe need a few more of that. So we've got a little bit of theming to do in here, so I'm going to add a few of the bushes. I'm going to bring up some of the landscape here just a little bit, and then I'm also going to add some fencing through here. From a theme standpoint, there's not really too much to do here. We don't really have much of an option besides the mine scenery, so it's all going to be some variation of that. What you can see here is I'm replacing some sections of this wood fence with a mesh fence, trying to make it look a little bit like it was haphazardly fixed, perhaps. So it also gives guests sort of a peek into the ride in this instance as well, because one of the things that I try and keep in mind is solid fences like the wood fence or the hedge fence. Those are at guest height, so in general, a guest couldn't see over them. They can look up and see things beyond, but if it's at ground level, they're not going to see it. So I want to make sure that when I do that, I'm at least leaving a little bit of space or some see-through type fencing in order to give ourselves a little bit better of a view for the guests. Just try to think through it from the guest's eyes and not line your paths on both sides with a wooden fence, because that would be kind of horrific to walk through, I would think. So next up, we've got a wooden coaster. So this is that sort of grassy area on the hillside in front of the park, and what I like about this one is that as you're coming in, you get this nice little valley that they've already made and a couple of scenery elements in there, and as you're walking up to the park entrance, you would kind of look up at this big mountain and ideally not really see anything beyond it. Maybe that drop tower sticks up out of the ground or something, but you're probably not going to see much else. But what I wanted to do is use this hillside as sort of a cool ride indicator as you come up, so you can kind of see something on the hill and get excited about what's on the other side and get yourself kind of amped up to get to the park. So what better thing to do here than a wooden coaster? And initially I'm thinking about a GCI coaster, because we have the classic wooden twister now. So that first out and back attempt wasn't really working, so I kind of went back to the drawing board here and looked at a few things. One of those things I looked at was Renegade at Valley Fair Park. This was built in, I want to say 2006, somewhere around there, and sort of a mid-tier GCI coaster that never seems to get a lot of love. Valley Fair is not exactly the prime park for visitation, I guess, but it is a nice little park. I do enjoy it. But it's got this kind of neat double curve drop, so it has this kind of steep section that twists one way, and then a shallower section that twists back in the other way, so you get this sort of cool S-bend element to it. And then it's got a little bit of an out and back section, and then the rest of it becomes twister. So that's kind of what we're going to do here, is a similar sort of deal. So we've already got the out and back, got the turnaround. Now we have a second turnaround that has the same sort of S-bend elements here, and now what I want to do is the third turnaround here, sort of halfway to the second one. This almost could pass as a CCI style layout if you flattened out the corners and did a little less banking perhaps, but in this instance I want to use the GCI elements just because we've got the articulated trains and everything, so we're going to continue with this one as more of a GCI style, which is really about the corners. It's about the airtime coming in and out of the corners, and really just sort of that distinctive GCI element to the ride. So here we have a kind of a nice, almost double out and back, I guess you could call it that. And now the only matter is to get back to the station. Of course, the station doesn't necessarily exist right now because we're still trying to figure out where that goes. As per typical with me building coasters, the station and everything are not the key elements of the ride, nor is it something that I tie myself to or start with. And in general, I almost always finish with it unless there's a real specific reason why to put it in a certain place. Mostly because I'm not really interested in where that sits. I'm building the park from scratch, so I can bring my pathway up to it. I can really mold the guest flow and all of the plazas and everything to wherever I stick the station. But what I really care about is where the lift, where the drop, where all of the other elements are going to sit in the rest of the ride. So from that standpoint, I really want to focus on getting the ride right, and then the station and the brakes and everything can kind of figure itself out after that. And you'll see that show up a lot in these builds as we've been going through these scenario videos, because you'll pretty often see me build a coaster and then sit there for maybe 10 minutes trying to figure out exactly how a brake run is going to fit in, just because it doesn't line up quite right or whatever it may be. And this is one of those instances here where I'm trying to figure out enough space for braking and enough space for a station and all of that. Since we don't have a mid-course, this is a 2-train ride, which means from a GCI standpoint, you need a station, that's the full length of the train. You need a brake run, which would also be the transfer track, that's a full length of the train. Even though we aren't showing transfer tracks in this series, we still have that brake run space there. So that's the one here, 90 degrees to the station. And then you also need a brake run to slow the train down. Those transfer track brake run and the actual slowdown brake are two separate things. They are not the same thing, so they have to be separate deals. And this is in general what you want to consider if you're building realistic coasters in the game, is brake runs for trains or for coasters. You should be at least the amount of trains that you have plus one in terms of brakes. So since we have a 2-train system here, we need to be able to, between the station and brakes, hold 3 trains effectively. So 1 train in the station, 1 train in the brakes, and our extra 1 in the other set of brakes. So that's generally a good rule of thumb for figuring out kind of realistic lengths of braking. And that's not always a hard and fast rule, of course. There's lots and lots and lots of exceptions, but for this instance, we are going to make sure that that's correct. For GCI, there actually aren't too many exceptions to that, so that's what we're going to do here, and set that up. We're also going to drop in another one of those dummy block brakes there at the beginning of the first brake run, just so that the train can clear it sooner and we can get that other coaster train off the lift just a little bit sooner. So from a game mechanic standpoint, it's going to just speed it up ever so slightly. So now we're over on the other side of the train tracks here, so got to connect that back. I built myself a 2x2 plaza, which is going to let me drop in a scenery element there at some point. We are going to call the Wild Mouth Dynamite Blaster, hearkening ourselves back to Dynamite Dunes from the very, very beginning, and I think that's a nice little touch there for sure. I'm going to rework the queue for our train, and then also this will let us get a second pathway up and over here. I don't necessarily need a second pathway, I just kind of like the cleanliness of it, and we'll eventually drop another ride up there, but for now it's just going to be that wooden coaster. But that one's all done and gives us a nice, I don't know, I was going to say second coaster, but really each of those dive coasters count as one. You could kind of sort of say that the mine train is also one. So you might say this is coaster number 4. Maybe it's 3, since we're not really considering that mine train a coaster. But regardless, it doesn't really matter. It's getting guests through the door, which is what we want. And now we've got ourselves this rapids. So the whole place really lends itself well to a rapids ride because we've got a lot of vertical faces, so we can put some tunnels and stuff in here and get this thing all settled in very nicely. And we have some scenery here that I generally want to work around. Ideally, I don't want to get into it if I can. Granted, I can always rebuild it because we have the scenery unlocked for that, but for the most part, I want to just kind of leave it as is and kind of work around it, mostly as a bit of a challenge and to kind of respect that original scenery just a little bit. You are not really required to put in drops on a rapids ride. Now, I know from a stat standpoint, I think you need a drop, but rapids rides do not all have drops. Actually, most of them don't have major drops. Certainly things like Cali Rapids at Disney World and Popeyes at Universal ILA or Infinity Falls at SeaWorld or some of the big ones like that, they do have big drops on them, but more traditional rapids ride really don't. They just have sort of continued downward gradient with a lift hill either at the beginning or at the end or maybe even in the middle, and that's about it. So I don't necessarily feel the need to put a big drop in there, but if I can, I don't mind at least a couple of tiles worth just to get a nice little splashdown, sort of a key focal feature of the ride. And we are going to put our lift here in the middle, and you can see also I built the ride layout first and then came back and added the specialty elements. This is really just so that I can get the layout down and figure out what I want to do without having to reselect each one of these things every single time. It's just easier that way, I think, to build the thing and then figure out how it's all going to interact and what all special elements we're going to have. What I did do is put ourselves a retention pond down here. So really all of your rapids rides and water rides in general, so like your splash boats or your flume or things like that, want a body of water, whether it's part of the ride itself or something off to the side. You want a body of water because at night, when these rides are drained, they don't send it all down the sanitary sewer. They send it to some kind of a retention pond where it's then pumped back the next day with some added water for evaporation and loss and all that kind of thing. So generally, every one of these types of water rides that are out there in real life have some type of retention pond somewhere. So in general, I recommend having one on your layouts. Just from a realism standpoint, it looks a little bit better. So here we are with our finished layout, and I'm going to bury both of our entrance and exit, which is going to let us then bring those out of the ground here a little bit and also not have to worry about trying to deal with that sort of retention pond area down there as well. This is a little bit of an awkward spot because we did remove all of the pathway down here in this valley, but we'll bring the sort of a spur pathway down here, so it's a bit of a dead end. Unfortunately, it's going to kind of remain that way, but guests don't seem to be having a huge issue with it, so I'm generally okay with that. Have to rework the swinging ship here just a little bit so we get that kind of interesting crossover there, which I think is generally fine. So here we're going to connect this whole thing down, and it's a little bit awkward of a connection down to this space, but I'm going to try and smooth it out just a little bit, realizing here that I can't quite see the whole thing, so we're going to use the cutaway view that OpenRCT has, which is amazing. Very useful if you ever have a tight area you can't quite see. Noticing that I am indeed one tile too low, so we're going to stick that here and call it a day. So now we've got ourselves a nice little setup, and this whole thing is connected. We can open it up and get ourselves situated and smooth it out a little bit. So before we finish in this area, I want to build a car ride, and the cars are going to be trucks this time because it feels appropriate for the mine theme. So for some reason it starts with this default blue color, which is a little bit odd. I have a very hard time coloring my car ride tracks anything other than black, gray, or brown. Generally brown because it looks like this is meant to be wood slats, which is a lot of what traditional car rides were. I don't necessarily love the overall look, from a custom scenery standpoint. Ideally, I would put this on some kind of a tarmac and have like a center rail. which might be like a half invisible piece of RMC single rail track or something. But in this instance, what we have is what we have. This is the ride, so it's a fairly traditional type of ride, and you can kind of see we've got a good space to work around here for this. So we can make a big loop, wrap ourselves around the Rapids ride, so it kind of has some nice little interaction elements there. And it lets us go across that drop and do some other kind of fun things with that. So that will be a good one for us. We can put our station here, let us do an entrance and an exit, and now we can connect up to our little dead end space down here. We're going to do the same thing here with the queue. Now this also adds even more interaction for the ghost train that's cruising through there. So at least it adds some more interest for that, more stuff to see perhaps. Going to revise and simplify out the pathway that comes down to these two rides, and it also gets a nice little view there of the train and the mine train and the car ride and everything, so you kind of get that cool little peek through that whole space. So you can see trying to simplify out this just a little bit, mostly because I don't love having more than two sloped pieces in a row on our pathways, but in this instance it's three, but that's okay. Just kind of working around the elevations here, so we have to rework the elevation for the car ride a little bit, which is fine. Overall change in elevations is good, and in general you want to do that on your rides just to create a little bit of interest. But we've got space down here for a food stall, so I can drop in a burger bar buried in the landscape there. I like to bury those when I can, just because it feels like something that you might see in certain kind of artificial space there. So there's some more bauxite names, bauxite swinger just then. So now we'll jump into the last ride of our stream today, and this is going to take a couple of minutes here to build. So we're going to do an inverted coaster, and initially is trying to find out where this thing starts. And again, you can see we're not starting with a station, we're not starting with a lift, we're not even starting with a drop. I'm starting with a middle point of the ride and trying to decide how I want to go from here. Mostly what I wanted to do is have this kind of nice curving drop that sort of followed the landscaping here, that started out with a corkscrew up at the top, or a flat spin if you're going by B&M Inverted Coaster terminology. Then I also wanted to turn up into a 0G roll like this. For anyone who is coaster savvy, you probably already recognize this as a Nemesis inspired layout. So that's what we're kind of sort of doing here, and you can see using that whole dummy track idea again and moving it over by one just to see how this one looks and see how it works. You can see too the green dive coaster there is in the way. I think that's a Zygorator 2 perhaps. So what we're going to do eventually is move that thing. But the dummy track worked out this time, so I deleted the original and kept the dummy track. So now we have this ride to work with, and we can put in our corkscrew here. And this starts to give an idea about height, because we know we've got to beat that corkscrew, so we don't have to go terribly fast over it, but we're going to have to be at least 4 to 5 heights taller than that to start. So that kind of gives us an idea of exactly how high we're going to go on this thing. So it's not necessarily going to be fully Nemesis in terms of we're not going to stay right on the ground the whole time. But we're going to have a fairly similar-ish layout here with the starting flat spin, some of these diving corners into the valley, and then also the 0G roll and the loop. One of the sort of overly optimistic things here was to see if maybe we could get a loop around Zygorator there, which, as I've said before, I don't love threading loops unless it is a very, very natural thing and it feels right. So I wanted to test, first of all, if the inverted coaster could do a diagonal threading, and it can. The challenge is you got to be fairly different elevation and height, so we'd have to go down a good deal further. We just don't have the space for that, so that's not something that we're going to do. One of the challenges here of building in this existing plot is that we've got a lot of things that are just in the way. So we're going to make all sorts of adjustments here, not just to the dive coaster, but also to our ghost mine, and also to the train, and also to the queue, and also to the paths, and basically rebuild this entire area just because it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt. Here, too, is trying to figure out maybe how this thing wants to start, and part of this is just fitting it in, even if I know that I'm not going to do that. Like, I know I'm definitely not going to do that helix underneath of the wooden coaster there that undermines the structure on, that entire element. but I wanted to at least see how it fit, because maybe it was good enough that it would warrant a change in the wooden coaster layout. Not that I necessarily want to do that, but sometimes it's a possibility. So that's what I wanted to do, is at least start there and kind of see what was going to work. And now you can see I'm running into our mine train, so we're going to move that out of the way and see how that fits. And that works fairly well here. Also going to move our station just a little bit so that we have a little bit of room to work with here, which is going to let us drop down first, get a little bit of height differentiation here. Also go ahead and put this whole thing into a tunnel, and now we have a different turnaround for the beginning. We can extend the brake run here at the end, and we're good as new. So loop here seems like the right thing to do, and then the question is, where do we go from here? And the kind of first thought would be up. The challenge is there's a coaster in the way, the same coaster. So we can try and go steeply up, which you don't want to go from flat to slope to immediately steep. It just doesn't look good from a smoothness standpoint, so you always want that extra slope piece in there, at least at this speed. So in general, we're going to do that, but it doesn't fit very well. So we're going to rethink how we're going to do this here a little bit, and that turnaround is going to change just a little bit. It's not going to look super smooth, if we're being honest. I don't quite love that, but it's the best that I can do kind of with the clearances and everything. The inverted coaster has the triple height clearance, which is a little bit annoying, and it's something you kind of have to get used to a little bit. I don't know if it necessarily needs the triple height clearance, but such is the game has given us, so there we are. We're going to deal with it. So what I decided to do is come out of the loop and go into the sort of high G corner here, which might not be great for our stats, but it is going to be great for our layout because it can actually fit, and we don't have to worry about trying to cross over that other element there, and I think it looks pretty good so far. You can see I just temporarily built in that station up top so I could run the ghost train. If you are running Open RCT 2, you have the ability to do that. Original game, you did not, so if you're just running this as like RCT Classic or Deluxe, you can't do that. But thankfully, through the magic of Open RCT 2, we can run our ghost train, which is really helpful in terms of understanding pacing and just trying to see, does that element go too slowly, or is it okay? You can see here, I'm trying to figure out how to finish this thing with a really cool interaction here by crossing over top of the one drop, then crossing over top of the loop track, then going underneath of the 0G roll in a clearance that wouldn't work anywhere else, but can work because it's upside down. And as it turns out, we can kind of get through there, and it just takes a little bit of work. The trouble is, A, the train won't fit through there, and B, there really is no place for a brake run-on station. So unfortunately, that one's not going to work. So trying to look at a couple of other options here, we've got a few things that we can do, but first of all, we're just going to axe the train because there's just not really anywhere to fit in here. Remember earlier I said we've got to get at least to the right height to get that cobra or the corkscrew squared away. So that also means we got to get ourselves back up to whatever that station level may be. And it kind of appears that the station level is going to be somewhere around where it is now there at the +3 or +9, I guess it is, level there. And that generally works okay. I don't really want to cut away the whole rest of this mountain. What I do want to do is continue to try and smooth out this turnaround a little bit. It's just not quite working out for me, but in the end, there's only kind of so much you can do with this. So it's a little bit elongated, perhaps, but I'm okay with it. I think it passes, so we'll be all right with it. And this is also mostly just a stall because I can't quite figure out what I want to do at the end of it. By the way, I am building this ride in pause mode. It was one of those kind of debates that I had with the channel at the very beginning with the folks that were on stream to kind of see if they really minded. You know, it's not necessarily in the spirit of the original game in terms of beating all of the challenges without pausing, but the thing is, when we're spending this much time trying to get realistic coasters that look good and really work with the space, at some point we need to give ourselves a little bit of grace here and a little bit of extra time to make them look as good as we can, because I think you guys are watching because you like the style and you like the overall look, not because you want to see somebody beat the goals in exactly the correct way. So from what I understand, kind of the idea here is let's focus on the overall look and feel. So I am pausing or building in pause mode for coaster layouts, nothing else. We're going to actually even disable that ability to do so when we're not building the coasters. So just a little bit of an FYI there in case you're wondering why I am blowing so much time on this. So in the meantime, you can see we redid the first drop there to kind of have this Great Bear-esque beginning with a drop off into a helix and then a little bit of a dip before we get through that first flat spin. And now we're slowly working our way to what makes sense for a station and a brake run, including those diagonal brakes. So now it's just trying to figure out how on earth we get this thing back. So if we come out of that tunnel with the corner and we do a flat spin there, we can absolutely not make it fit just because we've got to use the large corners and we got to get diagonal, so it's just not happening. There's a couple other things we can do, and we're going to try those different bits and pieces. And I'm generally a big proponent of just kind of throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. And in this instance, we are going to try and rework everything from the loop here over. And part of that is going into the diagonal here, putting in a little bit of a dip, and then going back up like we did before. Just instead of a flat corner and then a climb into the flat spin, we're going to climb immediately, just like this, which is going to let us put our flat spin right here, which is actually going to set us up fairly nicely to curve around and come right back into these brakes. So that's what we're going to do here. I got to lower ourselves down because we can't connect on the diagonal, but I just wanted to test out here, so I'm not doing it with banking, but we can use the 3x3 corner and then go into the diagonal, and it's not quite lining up, but that's okay because we can just extend our brake run, which is what we're going to do. So again, following typical brake run type things, we're going to have a space to slow down the train and a space to hold the train. We're going to use 2 of the trains. Unfortunately, we don't have the 4 across, so I guess technically this is a Giovanola, but we're going to pretend this is a B&M because that's what it is. So we'll use 2 trains there and call it a day. And that's going to call it a day for this video too. So thank you very much for watching. Definitely coming back and catch part 2, and we'll see you then. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. See you later. Bye now.